Esteemed colleagues, we continue our working day in the UCMC. The topic of the next event is Heads of Villages, Ceremonial Bystanders, or real representatives of communities' interests. Our guests are Andriy Krupnyk, Director of Analytical Center of the Association for Support of Self-Governance Initiatives, Natalia Novak MP, Oleksiy Kolesnikov, Analyst of the Association for Support of Self-Governance Initiatives. Greetings, esteemed colleagues. Today we would like to share our views on such a topic which is directly related to the reform of self-governance. We found out today the Institute of Heads of Villages is very important, and the Ukrainian organization Association for Support of Self-Governance Initiatives made the research, and we found out what's happening in the sphere of election legislation of heads of villages, what are the powers of that institution, and how to organize better the work of the heads of villages so that the interests of communities, first of all periphery communities, are represented and defended. Natalia Novak MP is participating in our briefing. She's one of the co-authors of the law on self-organization of the population and how to build relations in rural and municipal communities. That is what we would like to discuss today. Thank you. Good afternoon. Self-governance is the basis of the state, and the reform is being implemented in local self-governance. The state goes along the way of reducing the number of territorial communities, uniting them so that more money is left for maintaining these territorial communities. The law was passed on merging territorial communities. Unfortunately, there were no amendments introduced into the administrative territorial system of Ukraine, but the community started to merge. Many village, rural, many villages and townships, they are left without the head of their micro-community. The community has become big, but who will represent the interests of a small village? And so the question is now, someone has to be appointed, and that is why we started thinking of heads of villages. When the law on merging communities was drafted, we were thinking of whether the heads are to be elected or appointed, whether the head should be a civil servant, or should the law on bodies of self-organization of population is to be applied. If the community believes that they need to have such a body that will represent their interests, then maybe they have to create the body of self-organization of the population. And so the decision was made to have the heads who will be elected. There are 3 laws which provide for different moments of introducing amendments to the existing legislation. But still there are some questions which haven't been, issues that haven't been addressed. Who will decide whether this territorial community needs the head, or maybe the council will decide how many heads should there be in their community. Maybe there will be 1 head per 2-3 villages. What about the local budget? And this is the new stage of saving money. So that is the first issue that is to be addressed, but generally I believe that sometimes we are copying the experience of foreign countries, especially in merging territorial communities, and we have 3 levels, regional, district councils, and basic level is communities. In Poland, they understand that 1 level is an extra one, and this is an obstacle to efficient decision making. Even Anatoly Matviyenko, who's an expert in local self-governance, he writes that it is important to have 2 levels, but talking about heads, we get another sub-level. And we think this is like a representation position, because the head is elected, but he can become member of executive committee. This way, this situation needs to be addressed, and the amendments are to be introduced into the legislation. Also, we need to think of that not just 1 head represents, but 2-3 persons should represent the interests of their community. We are grateful that Andriy Krupnyk's organizations are addressing these issues. They study international experience and they provide their proposals and recommendations. Which law is to be finalized, which amendments are to be passed so that the law works.
Я надаю слово.
And I would like to give the floor to Oleksiy. Oleksiy is one of the main researchers.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I will try to present very briefly the results of our research. We have studied the first experience of the situation with the heads of villages, how the heads of villages were elected, how many of them were elected, and what the problems they experience I would like to point out the problems which require a solution from the Parliament of Ukraine. So the first problem was that the elections are very slow. As of September, first heads of villages were held out of 174 territorial communities because the legislation does not set specific period within which the election should be finished. Instead of this, the law says that unless the elections are held, the responsibilities of heads of villages are put on the heads of the previous heads of villages. Thus, they are not interested in organizing elections in the course of which they have no chances to win. And in some villages, those elections are simply not appointed. Then the legislation does not provide any budget allocations for such elections, and it puts funding on these elections on the local budgets. For some small, very small local communities, the lack of funds is an obstacle. What do we suggest? We suggest amendments to the current law. So the first is amendment to the final provisions. We suggest to limit the period for elections. That is, it should happen within 6 months period after after election of the new head of local community. Then the draft law number 3535 about changes to the law of Ukrainian local elections, and we suggest to amend this with the allocation from the state budget on these elections of village heads. The next problem, the village heads have not enough power to cope with their responsibilities. The law on local self-governments just say that they have to be elected and that's it. And the heads of villages should decide themselves. The draft law number 4642, which offers amendments to the status of village heads. Part of those village heads, part of those amendments are very useful, but some of those amendments require corrections. For example, the draft law 4742 suggests to extend responsibilities of village heads considerably, but at the same time it suggests that village heads should not be obligatory member of the executive committee in the executive committee of the United Community at higher level. If this membership is not obligatory, then the village heads would not be members of the community executive committees, and they would not be able to make necessary decisions, and that's why we suggest that this provision in active legislation should not be changed. That is, village heads should be members of the community executive committees automatically because of their positions. The draft law 4742
невірно. Тобто і тут ми повністю загалом підтримуємо те, що
and besides that, the draft law allows to repeal the village heads, which lacks in current legislation. The draft law 4742 allows termination of the village head position by the United Community Council. Here is a big risk. We can recollect in this context what happened recently in Ukraine, when there was early termination of responsibilities among local governments. And in this case, again, this can make the village heads very dependent on the on the community council, and would not allow them to stand for the interests of their villages. So these were our summary of our suggestions. We are limited in time. These were very important issues, very profound issues. That's why we prepared handouts for journalists. We have two versions, the abridged one and the full one, and also we came into agreement with the working group, Mr. Dekhtyarchuk, who is an MP. He is a co-author in this draft law. We came to agreement that we would work together between the first and second reading of the law. Also, we cooperate with MPs, just as we did this with other draft laws on local self-governance. So we will disseminate our analytical materials among all MPs and encourage them to support our draft laws. We hope very much, dear friends, that initiating reform for the sake of people, all our levels of governments will really take the interests of people as important and as a top priority of their work, and will be ready to include additional creative resources. We have to involve proactive people, allow them to be responsible, and allow them to resolve real issues.
I agree with that because the person cannot be made happy if the person doesn't want it. It's very important to initiate the election of the heads. Who should be the initiator? The council of the community. But micro-community does not need a head. Maybe they will find the person who will want to get salary and do nothing. So the community should understand that they need a person, or they need somebody. There should be an initiative group, and they will say, we initiate election of the head in our village, or we initiate creation of a body of self-organization of the population which will manage our micro-community. We also need to understand who can recall them. If a subject who believes that the person that was elected is working with violations or doesn't defend the interests of the population, and then such person will be called back. The head of the village could be very active, aggressive.
Раді вони приймуть рішення про те, що
So I believe that we should give the possibility to initiate it to a higher body of governance.
стосовно позбавлення певних повноважень.
In general, I believe that this is a certain experiment. We have never had this institution of heads of villages. This is an attempt, a test. We will see how it's working, whether it is important to have it, whether it justifies all the expectations. And in the future, I believe that the legislation on self-governance is to develop, and we will create such conditions for self-governance which are good for Ukraine. Thank you for this opportunity to provide this information. Thank you. See you soon.
Колеги, наступна подія буквально за кілька хвилин. Полковник Андрій Лисенко.